Hello, and welcome to this episode of Strange as It Seems, a podcast about history, occultism, espionage, secret societies, mystery, conspiracy, and weirdness high and low. The common denominator is that the topics all embody the strange, that is, something that's unusual or surprising in a way that's unsettling or hard to understand. The aim is to reveal and discuss, but without any definite expectation of explaining or proving anything. Because, more often than not, the closer you look at the strange, the stranger it gets. Hi, I'm Professor Rick Spence.
And I'm Stephen Austin.
And welcome to another episode of Strange as It Seems.
Okay, what are we talking today?
We're going to talk about Jack Parsons, or to give his full name, John Whiteside Parsons.
Never heard his for John?
John.
Okay.
Well, that's not even his real name. We'll get to that. That's not the name he was born under.
Okay.
But John Whiteside Parsons, better known as Jack Parsons, one of the founding fathers of the American space program in his way.
Yeah, I don't know much beyond. He was a rocket scientist who did occult stuff, and that's where it ends.
He was a follower of Aleister Crowley. In fact, one of Crowley's one of his latter disciples.
Okay. So are we going to walk through his bio, or?
Well, what are we going to talk about in Parsons? He's become a kind of legendary figure, both because of his connection to Crowley and also because of his connection to rocketry and space program. I mean, he's got a crater on the dark side of the moon named after him.
Really?
He's also connected to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, JPL, which the inside joke being that stands for Jack Parsons Lab, which is a bit of an exaggeration, but not too much. He probably helped put the place on the map. But so what I'd like to do today is sort of, go through his career, not step by step, talk about his relationship with Crowley, but also talk about something else, which I don't think has gotten appropriate attention, and is one of those things that's always of great interest to me, is that his possible connection to espionage.
Okay.
Because if there was anybody who could have been, should have been, and might have been a spy, it was Jack Parsons. And that has to do with any number of things. So let's begin with the guy himself. He's born in 1914, which is an interesting sort of time period. And it's one of the things you always have to keep in mind about people. They're born into a particular place and time.
Where's he from?
California. Okay. So he's born into a wealthy family in Pasadena, in Southern California. Okay. His father was Marvel Parsons. His mother was Ruth Whiteside. Okay. The Whitesides were a wealthy family in the Southern California environment. His father was, his parents were only married for a relatively brief period of time. He was born in 1914. They split about a year later. Yeah, that had to do with Mama Ruth finding that her hubby was consorting with other women. One story is he was actually bringing prostitutes into the house. It doesn't matter. Anyway, she was betrayed. She kicked him out. And she not only kicked him out of the house, she basically kicked him out of her son's life. So, and a not unimportant detail is that Jack Parsons had virtually no relationship with his father from that point on. Now, Daddy Marvel Parsons returned to his native Massachusetts, eventually had quite a successful career in the U.S. Army, and remarried, had a son. So Jack Parsons had a half-brother, which I think he met only once or twice. But it wasn't until Jack Parsons was an adult that he really had only a couple of meetings with his father. So he grew up completely around his mother and around his grandparents, her parents, who were wealthy. And that, that's, we're talking about someone who's born in a particular time and place.
Yeah.
So he is born into the kind of early la-la land of Southern California, into the California elite. He grows up as a child and adolescent in a situation of general affluence. That will change. That begins to change with the Depression when the family loses much of its money, and that he has to go to work, which is something which is new. So his birth name was Marvel. He was named after his dad, Marvel Whiteside Parsons.
Okay.
Because his mother then decided she didn't like her ex-husband, she was never going to refer to her son by that name, so she started calling him John. And then his friends called him Jack.
Jack.
Okay, so his real name is Marvel. His mother called him John. His friends called him Jack.
Jeez.
And, he seems to have been, a fairly precocious kid. Follows a not uncommon route of never doing particularly well in school. His academic performance his entire life was always very erratic. There would be situations.
Sorry.
Oh,
No, it's not dog.
hold on here.
Start it over again.
Okay. His academic performance throughout his life could probably best be described as erratic. In grade school, he was generally a fairly poor student, didn't pay much attention to his lessons, also didn't get along with his classmates particularly well. He did form one early friendship that would last most of his life with a kid by the name of Ed Foreman, who would later work with him in the realm of rocketry. But for the most part, he was a kid who you could probably say didn't have a lot of friends, was picked on, and spent way too much time with his mom. So
how do you end up doing? I mean, physics? What?
No, he never graduated from college.
Okay.
He has no academic degrees whatsoever. At various times, he attended fitfully Pasadena City College, briefly Stanford, even more briefly USC, later on as an adult. Never took a degree, never did particularly well in a kind of formal university environment. And Jack Parsons wasn't a guy who was into taking classes.
Yeah.
All right. And here again, he was one of those people who didn't want to learn things. He wanted to do things.
So was he into blowing shit up in his backyard? Or?
Well, as a kid, he got into reading pulp magazines and science fiction.
Okay.
At amazing stories type of thing. And that could have a profound impact on a lot of people. Pulp literature was one of those things. I can identify with that to a degree. I have to admit that I was never terribly drawn towards great literature. I was drawn towards pulp literature. Edgar Rice Burroughs, Robert E. Howard, Clark Ashton Smith, H.P. Lovecraft. Those are all the sort of things that called to me. And those can either profoundly warp one, or they can open up whole new vistas in this case. But he was probably kind of lonely as a kid. His grandparents were elderly. His mother wasn't really that young. He had spent a good deal of time by himself. At some point early on, according to his later recollections, even as a child, let's say 10, 12, that range, he developed an interest in what could be called the occult. At one point, he claimed he tried to summon the devil. So he was just going to do that. He was going to have his own little summoning ritual.
What did you touch on the religious background of? Was his mom like?
They were, as far as I know, conventional Christian Protestants.
So maybe that's Pulp Fiction.
There was no strong, that I can think of, religious training on his part.
So why would somebody, you've mentioned your own experience growing up in California. Was it in the air? Was it the time period? Because this would be what, the 30s, 40s? If he's born in 14, then this is the 20s.
Mostly in the 20s is his childhood.
So what's the...
Well, Southern California was awash in cults of every possible denomination you could think of, but I don't think he really had much contact with those. Why did he go in that direction? Because it was in his nature to do so.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that you can find. There's always this effort to try to, well, there was this influence, there was that influence. Look, I would guarantee you that you could take different individuals and you could put them in exactly the same petri dish that Jack Parsons was in. You could subject them to the same influences, the same things would be there, and some would take to it and others wouldn't. It depends upon what their nature sort of calls them to in that case.
Yeah.
That's an idea that a lot of people don't like or find uncomfortable or reject. It certainly goes against the tabula rasa idea that he was a blank slate, that things were just impressed upon, which I'd have to say I don't think is true at all.
Well, if you
the
ever
slate
had kids,
is not blank. There are things written on the slate, and that then determines what other space or things can be written into.
There's no better explanation of that than having kids yourself and then seeing like, oh, you're already.
If you think you're going to shape them into the little beings you want them to be, you are just dead wrong.
Yeah.
Okay, that is not going to happen. The program is going to work its way out no matter what,
and it's your fault probably, but
you can twist it and tweak it, and you can try to restrain it, but you're not going to stop it from moving forward.
Okay, someone saying
it's like stopping them from growing.
Yeah,
you can't do that. You can't, they're just going to grow in the way that they're going to go.
You just guide.
You can't will them not to get acne or to get it, whichever way you want to. That those things are just going to work out according to the way that their genetic programming is putting it forward. So Jack Parsons, like everybody else, followed his particular programming, and that certainly was influenced by his probably lonely childhood and his probably overprotective mother. That's led to there's all kinds of speculation about Parsons and what influenced his worldview, and one was that he and his mother actually developed a kind of Oedipal relationship. There's some that actually believed it was an incestuous one. That seems unlikely, not impossible, but unlikely. But they were very emotionally dependent upon each other. There was a very, very close bond between them, which maybe in some ways he was rebelling against. But he showed early on a kind of interest in things that were outside the normal framework. There was a certain rebelliousness about him. Again, I don't think he did well in school. He didn't pursue a university degree because setting for hours and days and weeks and months and years at time, taking courses and getting grades was not what it was he wanted to do. He wanted to do things. He didn't want to learn about things.
Yeah.
Which meant in some cases he was a bit abrupt about going after it. So keep in mind, this was a guy who was going to become very skilled in the application of explosives through experience, not through study. He would learn that on the job, but he liked explosives because he liked blowing things up.
Yeah.
That was part of it. It starts with setting things on fire, then that goes to blowing things up.
So, I mean, I was listening to our maybe it was George Norrie, but let's just pretend it was Art Bell. Somebody calling in, whiz kid, about, hey, I'm from such and such, and what general? It wasn't LeMay. It was some general supposedly gets put on him as a handler. Because he's a whiz kid just setting off rockets in North Carolina, that's where it was. So was it something like that where he's like, I'm going to go work for the ordnance department? Or like,
well, his career sort of goes like this. He has the rich kid's upbringing, lonely rich kid's upbringing, up until about 1930, about the time of the Depression. So in 1929, when the Depression starts, I think he and his mother are off on a tour of Europe. That was the type of thing that if you had money and you were from the right part of Pasadena, you could do. But after that, a number of things happen. The family loses much of its money. The wealthy grandparents die. The fortunes decline. They never become impoverished, but they go from being rich to, sort of genteel, almost poor. It was the type of thing that it was difficult for him to, later on, when supposedly the opportunity came for him to go to Stanford, the real problem was that he couldn't afford it. I'm not sure I quite buy that. I think he probably could have. I think that was more an excuse than anything else. But he eventually had to go to work now to help to support himself and the family finances. And so in the early 30s, he goes to work for the Hercules Powder Company.
Okay.
And that was a large manufacturer of gunpowder and other explosives.
Is this like a Dow derivative or just something?
I don't know who Hercules...
DuPont, I'm thinking.
No, I don't think that. I think they were independent.
Okay.
I don't think they were a DuPont subsidiary. Okay. But Hercules was a big name. I mean, if you were a gold miner and you're buying dynamite, you're probably getting Hercules dynamite. But they had plants there. They also had manufacturing plants up around the San Francisco Bay Area. That's how he ended up there. Okay. That's how he was briefly enrolled in Stanford. But he learned about explosives pretty much on the job. And I think he'd been playing around with this stuff as a kid. Mm-hmm. But he had a native talent for it, and the idea not just in dealing with existing explosives, but how you might actually improve them, which for an explosives company had a certain advantage. So he was a self-taught explosives chemist. Okay. And that then sort of segued directly into his interest in rocketry, which was also something very, this again had to do certainly with his exposure or interest in science fiction, which often had a great emphasis on space travel. Yeah. I mean, you can always ask, what's the chicken and the egg here? Did his interest in science fiction, was that a result of his interest in science and in rocketry, or was it the other way around? I tend to think that they're all just part of the same.
It's the milieu, right? It's
the same process. I mean, it showed you the way in which his mind was working in some way. And that sort of, rocketry was a new experimental field. It involved things that blew up. Although now what you want in a rocket is you want a controlled explosion. Yeah. And this was going to be Parsons' really great technical achievement, was the development of solid fuel rocket engines. Yeah. And that was the problem that he and his friends and others had for years in trying to come up. You need something that has a great deal of combustive power that's going to propel the rocket at a high speed to a great altitude without it simply blowing up. It's still a problem with rockets to this day, if you've been paying attention to things, whether or not they're going to blow up in the launch pad. Yeah. Because it's all about controlling this tremendous explosive force. And he begins basically by the middle of the 30s. He's now been drawn into the orbit of people, including Ed Foreman, others, friends of his that he will make around the Guggenheim Aeronautical Laboratory and at the California Institute of Technology, GALCIT, what will later become JPL. And so keep in mind, he's never formally employed there, really. He's not a scientist at this. He is an amateur. He is a talented amateur who comes in and attracts the attention of people like, the most important was probably a aeronautical engineer and scientist by the name of Theodor von Karman. No. Okay. Well, Theodor von Karman has an interesting background. He's really kind of Parsons' mentor. Okay. Because he has an official position at GALCIT, at Caltech. He thinks Parsons has talent. Other people weren't. He's not just this crazy kid who wants to blow things up. And he has a great deal of influence in shaping his career. But there's some interesting things about Theodor von Karman. He is of Hungarian Jewish background. Okay. He had come over to the U.S. To some extent as a refugee from Europe, but he also had a background. If you go back to his native Hungary in 1919, in the aftermath of the First World War, there was a short-lived communist republic in Hungary, a thing called the Hungarian Soviet Republic. Okay. Lasted a few months before it collapsed. But it was, for a long time, it was the only independent communist regime that existed outside of the Soviet Union. Yeah. And During that short-lived Hungarian-Soviet Republic, Theodor von Karman had an official position in education. He was also a member of the Hungarian Communist Party. When the Hungarian-Soviet Republic collapsed, he then went to Germany, where he later became a member of the KPD, the German Communist Party. Now, when he was later questioned on this by the FBI, as he was, von Karman noted is that, well, yeah, I'd been a communist early on, but that sort of taught me that I wanted nothing more to do with this. And, it was a youthful infatuation that I got over. And they seemed to buy that, and he was a valuable asset to American science and also to the war program that was coming along. And no more was thought about it. But I think that's possibly interesting.
Why?
That the man who became Parsons' arguably most important mentor, his kind of interlocutor into the official world of rocketry and subsequently of weapons development, had a communist background. Because part of this then comes to Jack Parsons' connection to communism and to the Communist Party. So, Theodor von Karman may have been absolutely honest about what he was saying.
Yeah.
That yes, he had served as an official of the Hungarian Soviet Republic. He had been a communist for his time, and he was no longer. That was the general arc of a lot of people. But it's also possible he was lying.
Yeah.
And that he had never entirely abandoned his connections with that. And that von Karman's influence in some way may have helped push Parsons in that direction. I don't think that that's essential. I think that Jack Parsons, given his kind of Luciferian temperament, that might be a good way to describe him. He had this kind of Luciferian temperament, and in that case, communism was likely to have a kind of natural appeal to him. I mean, he checks a number of boxes. One, he came from a privileged background.
Which most communists are.
Okay, which many of them do. I mean, nothing will reveal to you the sins of the upper class than being born into it. No one can perceive that more clearly than one might have. But also, he lost much of that. So this is someone who was, early on raised in affluence, who then went to the opposite elements. Yeah. And, the heavens did not rise to save him from that. Let's put it this way. The traditional gods of his family, out of his wealthy family, did not protect him from what would happen later. It didn't protect his family from their poverty. It didn't help him in any other regards. And so looking for new gods would be a part of that. And communism could be one of those new gods. So in the middle of the 1930s, a number of things are going on with him. He's become involved in rocketry. He becomes part of a group called the Suicide Squad. And they got that name for a good reason, because what they did is that, often on their own, many of these things had to be paid for by themselves. In fact, a lot of the money from his day job actually went to sort of financing the experiments, because, Gausset was not going to pay for this on their own. They went out to the Arroyo Seco, the dry riverbed, still near Caltech to this day, and that's where you could go out, and this is where they launched their rockets.
Okay.
Not setting off fires, at least not too many of them, is what would probably happen today. Or at least not with the idea of burning down Pasadena in the process. And this was all dangerous stuff, because remember, you're trying to have these controlled explosions. And that didn't always work. And the way you find out that this is not a controlled explosion is that the rocket blows up.
So just out of curiosity, are they just doing fuel testing, or is this like, the extent of my knowledge of rocketry goes to the movie Rocket Boys. So it's like, are they manufacturing different rockets and components, or is it all just fuel?
Well, they're building the armor. They're building the rocket. That will contain the explosive.
They're doing the whole thing.
The purpose is, and they're just making these things, and fabricating them using Caltech to do that with or without official permission, and then hoping you don't get blown up. And this is where Parsons was sort of, he was at the lead of this. He was willing to take considerable risks, does not manage to get himself killed. Keep in mind, this is a man who will later be killed in an explosion.
Yeah.
In one. So that will, the explosives will eventually get him. But they haven't gotten him yet. The other thing that happens around 1935 is he gets married.
Okay.
And he marries a woman by the name of Helen Northrop. She's from a very respectable local family. Her father runs what seems to be a collection agency. Her family is also quite religious. They meet at a church dance.
So why is he at a church dance?
To meet girls, I think.
Yeah,
but that's that's an interesting thing. He actually meets his wife at a church dance, which shows that he's not so disaffected that he wouldn't go to a church dance.
Yeah. Well, for
on the other hand, she quite willingly sort of follows him into his later life of rocketry and occultism. She becomes an enthusiastic lifetime participant with him in this.
So this is 30 what?
35.
Okay.
35.
The occult stuff. I'm just curious. Is it at that point? I always try to place it in the. I said milieu earlier, like it's floating around. But was there California at the time? Was it like he's into occultism? That's awful, or is it just something that people kind of like? Oh, I'm vaguely interested in astrology, or
you get into this question as to. If you buy his story that as a child he tried to summon the devil, which again is one of those things that may or may not be true. It may be a story he liked to tell. The idea might. Considering his interest to things that were sort of on the outside, in the more essence. Remember, there was a sort of, I think, inherent attraction to this type of thing, but he doesn't really become a Crowleyite. He doesn't get drawn into something in terms of a kind of doctrinaire, a kind of occult dogma connected to Aleister Crowley until the end of the 1930s.
Okay.
So he doesn't really join, I'll explain more about this in a moment, a thing called the Agape Lodge until early 1939. Both he and his wife Helen, they do this as a couple. So in fact, it's an interesting question, to me anyway, as to when he really first becomes acquainted with Crowley and his writings.
Yeah.
And the general story, the general part of the narrative is that he was friends, this again probably from around the mid-30s, with a local car dealer in the Pasadena area called Robert Rapinski. Okay, so this guy is a used car dealer, which Parsons bought a car from, and they sort of become friends.
Let's talk about the car.
Keep in mind, you get a kind of different picture in this, don't you? Okay, meets his wife at a church dance, and he's friends with a guy who's a used car dealer, and the used car dealer likes to buy books at rummage sales, and sort of looking through some shelf of books that Rapinski had, Parsons runs across a copy of Conks on Pax, which is a book on magic, on occult philosophy written by Crowley back in 1907, one of Crowley's early works. And this attracted his attention. And that's probably because he recognized it as being, he was already probably familiar with Crowley's name, and he saw a book by him and he got it. But that seems to be, the timing to me on this is never entirely clear, but this is probably at least a couple of years before he ever gets around to joining the Crowleyite organization of the OTO or the Agape Lodge. And what else is he doing in this period? Well, this is where he starts again in the late 30s, probably around 36 or 37. He's drawn by some of his other associates in the Suicide Squad. They start attending a discussion group. And this is a discussion group which is supposedly just to talk about political ideas. It's actually a branch of the Communist Party.
Okay.
And it's led by Sidney Weinbaum. Okay, the two figures most connected with this are Sidney Weinbaum, who works at Caltech, and his friend Frank Oppenheimer,
Okay.
And Frank Oppenheimer is the brother of Robert Oppenheimer.
Right.
Both of them are members of the Communist Party.
Yeah.
They are very closely associated with the sort of big cheese of the Communist Party in the LA area, a guy by the name of Isaac Volkov.
Yeah.
And so Volkov is kind of, well, he's kind of the bag man. He's the paymaster for the party in much of Southern California. He also has a direct pipeline to the Soviet consulate in San Francisco and to the, what we'll call by its modern term, the KGB agency there, led by Gregory Heifetz. So there is a connection between Volkov and the resident intelligence officer in San Francisco, and between Volkov and Weinbaum and Oppenheimer and their discussion group, which will eventually transform into the professional group number 122 of the California Communist Party.
Oh, okay.
So, and this is directly targeting Caltech employees, scientists, students, and others. This was a whole effort to organize these membership and to recruit members into the party from this group. Some of Parsons' associates do indeed join the party. He later denied that he ever did, and in fact would later tell the FBI that this actually led to a falling out between he and Weinbaum, and the kind of end of their friendship, and he broke off the relationship. So he's saying that basically by 38, 39, by 38 he was attending meetings of this group, and by 39 he had dropped attending meetings.
And the argument being that they got too hardcore in one direction, or they officially...
he said that he was offered, that he was encouraged to join the party, but declined, and in doing so, that caused him to cut off associations with Weinbaum and the rest. That, again, was his later testimony to the FBI. Now, why were the FBI asking him those questions? Because Parsons later will get high security clearances because he's working upon secret military projects like missiles and rockets for the U.S. military. See why someone might be interested, the potentials that one could...
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Was it, just out of curiosity, this is related, but honeypotting or something similar to, the corruption of folks through different means by intelligence agencies, it wasn't like that, right? It was a pretty open, hey, you're intellectuals in the 20s and 30s, you're probably interested in communism anyway.
It depends on what you would be interested in people for. So the party, I mean, the basic goal of Weinbaum and Oppenheimer was to create a professional association, first as a political discussion group, and then find people who appeared to be amenable and useful for the party and recruit, simply grow the party. But you also have some aspect of being spotters for potential intelligence applications. Mm-hmm. And as Parsons became more and more involved in what could be called, quite aptly, the American military-industrial complex, I mean, once, particularly during the war years, he becomes involved in a whole variety of projects for both the Army and the Navy, and this will continue after the war. Then he has a wide variety of associations that would be of tremendous interest to the Soviets. In fact, one of the things that they were most... The whole area of Soviet espionage in that period that was beginning from the 30s and then on up even to the late 40s that was of key interest was something that was called the XY line, which was the technical line. Okay, this had anything to do with, rocketry, aviation, any kind of weapons development in terms of aviation. Whatever the Americans were doing this type of thing, they would want to know. So if you could find someone who had that kind of act, and we'll see there'll be other aspects to that as well. The other thing that Parsons did in this period, he was a subscriber to the People's World, which was the West Coast Communist Party newspaper, not the Daily Worker, but the People's World. And an interesting little detail to me is that he didn't receive that at his home address. He rented a post office box where that was delivered. Because apparently he didn't want commie newspapers being delivered in the mail.
Being an occultism is one thing, but...
So you've got, here again, you come down to this idea, how do you want to create the narrative? So here are the things that we know. You can look again at the kind of basic facts. By his own admission, Parsons had an interest in communism. He had a kind of natural, radical attraction to these type of things. It appealed to him on a certain level. He did attend meetings of what became a professional unit of the Communist Party. He was in contact with people like Weinbaum and Oppenheimer, who were active members and recruiters and spotters for the party. Mm-hmm. They, again, had a link which took them all the way to the Soviet intelligence apparatus in San Francisco. Those things are sort of plot points, the facts in this regard. He did subscribe to People's World. Yeah. So he had in this period a clear association with the Communist Party and with active communists who had links to Soviet intelligence. Mm-hmm. His narrative is that he broke that off simply because he wanted to go no further with it. It wasn't one of the interest. He didn't want to carry the romance any further than that, and that could be. There's nothing that says that couldn't be true. Remember, this is 1939. This is the same year of the Nazi-Soviet pact, in which a lot of people questioned their relationships with the party and broke it off, in which most did not. Although his separation seems to I've never seen any place where he claimed that, I couldn't stand, the Stalin-Hitler pact, and that's why I broke. It's just that I didn't want to be drawn into this any further. I just decided that was it, and I would just kind of cut ties. And he was also being drawn a bit deeper into the occult milieu at this point. So maybe that's where he was putting his energies. So that's a perfectly plausible story, Had a kind of an affair with communism, and then he broke it off.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it doesn't have to be the only story which is possible. And that could in some ways be connected to how important he might have been perceived.
Oh.
If in the view of certain people within the party, particularly in the view of someone like Heifetz, the intelligence officer in San Francisco, if Parsons had potential, here's a guy who's working in the whole realm of rocketry. He hasn't achieved a whole lot so far, but there's potential there. He's working in an important field, under the mentorship of another former party member from the past at Caltech. This might be a person we would want to cultivate, and in that case, in certain situations of that kind, a person would be told to cut their ties to the party. Sever ties. Break with it.
Sheep dip.
Badmouth it.
Yeah.
Okay, have no connection as much as possible to other members of the party. And the reason for that is that you're going to do important work. Yeah. In fact, you might be recruited for intelligence work. Yeah. So in this case, we don't want any, you make it look as if your ties are broken.
Right.
That happened.
I was going to say, how often?
That was a tactic which was actually used. It wasn't used a lot, but it was used in certain cases. That's actually much of the accusation that was later used against Robert Oppenheimer.
Yeah.
And, Robert Oppenheimer was in a somewhat similar position in a way. That is, his brother was a party member. Oppenheimer, certainly there were attempts to recruit him. If you extant Soviet documentation, mostly from what we have, notes taken from the KGB archive, suggest that there are any number of overtures that were made to him. He never accepted them. In other words, there's nothing in the available KGB documentation that shows that they were ever successful in recruiting Robert Oppenheimer, even though they tried. On the other hand, what eventually got Robert Oppenheimer into trouble is that he was approached by another, I think it was a University of California professor of literature, Hakon Chevalier. And Hakon Chevalier was a Communist Party member, and he had, he made this sort of overture towards Oppenheimer that, you come across any information that might be really useful to help peace or so on, then you can kind of feel free to pass it on. And what Robert Oppenheimer should have done was to report that.
Yeah.
But he didn't want to get Chevalier. He knew that would create trouble for him.
Right.
So he didn't. His argument was that, this guy was kind of a friend of mine.
Yeah.
I knew he was a communist. I knew he was approaching me for Soviet intelligence, but I didn't want to get him into trouble, so I didn't say anything about it.
So is the, I'm not up on Oppenheimer and I haven't seen the movie. But
they'll go into that.
I've heard, I heard they kind of skirted it a little bit, but was he the one who leaked nuclear information to the Soviets, or nobody knows?
Robert Oppenheimer?
Yeah.
Well, there were people who thought he did.
Yeah.
I'd say overall, probably not.
Yeah.
But would I say that it's absolutely impossible that he did? I mean, what he did do was a serious security breach. And the fact that was one of the main reasons why he eventually got his security clearance pulled, that under greatest things is probably not wholly unjustifiable. It meant you couldn't trust him entirely. So, it's understandable. You want to protect a friend or the rest of it, but, nevertheless, you're part of the secret project.
Yeah.
And you can't keep secrets otherwise. It was a questionable action on his part. But his brother certainly he was surrounded by people who were. I think he was certainly sort of swimming in the sea of active or secret communist. That was the term that was used for someone who was to leave the party. So he then became a secret party member. And outwardly, you could, in fact, assume the role of being a staunch anti-communist, whatever it was required to obscure your relationship with the party so that people would quit looking at you.
Yeah.
So in Parsons' case, I see no reason to reject his version of the story, which was that he just got bored with it or decided he didn't want to go any further and he quit. But on the other hand, I don't see any reason to reject wholly the other possibility, which was that he did sort of continue and that's the other possibility. He could simply have continued the relationship on another level. In other words, he didn't have to join the Communist Party to be recruited as an asset of Soviet intelligence. Most people who were Soviet assets were not.
Yeah.
It was another way of controlling them to a degree if they were. So you come back to that, I think in another episode we may have talked about the acronym of how you recruit people. MICE.
Well,
money, ideology, coercion, or ego. And in Parsons' case, money might have been important, but I don't think of too much. Ideology? Possibly, if he was in some way sympathetic to the communist idea, even if you don't become you can always become part of the I'm not a communist but party.
Right.
So, but in this case, ego might have been a portion of this. I can see why to his, let's say, Luciferian temperament, being a spy might well have appealed to him. Mm. And, of course, there's another possibility in this to keep in mind, that at some point, particularly if his espionage work for the Soviets had been detected on the American side, that he might have become a double agent. There's always the possibility that Jack Parsons agreed to work to the Soviets, work for them, while actually becoming a true blue American, either one of those is a kind of possibilities. So remember, that's what you're really dealing with here. And I go back. This is what the reality of history is. It's not one thing. It's a range of possibilities. This could be. That could be. Maybe this is a little more likely than that.
Yeah.
But both of them exist in that realm.
to play devil's advocate, or maybe, I don't know, wrong term, but what's the likelihood based off of other examples where there, I know there's double agents in history, espionage, but at that time period, folks, I mean, were there double agents for the Soviet Union and the United States? Do we know about other folks within?
Well,
sensitive?
Most of the ones you know about, like Elizabeth Bentley or Whittaker Chambers, are former communists who get disillusioned with the party and then go to the FBI and tell everything they know. Initially, in many cases, not to be fully believed. It was only, Whittaker Chambers in 1939, the same period, actually goes to a Deputy Secretary of State, Adolf Berlin, and tells him everything about the spy ring that he was managing, and nothing's done about that for years. I mean, it's not until 1945 that anybody pays. Well, because part of it was, the reality of it was even in the lead up to World War II, to the extent the U.S. government was concerned about espionage at all, which for the most part they weren't. That was, there's no real counterintelligence agency. There's the FBI. But J. Edgar at this point is much more still interested in making headlines about combating gangsterism in the Midwest. Foreign spies weren't a big deal. And if you were looking at foreign spies, you were looking at German and Japanese espionage. That's what was of interest. What were the Russians doing? I mean, that had come up in the Dees Committee, the House American Activities Committee, which had made various investigations in the 30s. There was ample testimony that had been presented there that there was some kind of Russian espionage which was taking place, but it wasn't likely to arouse much attention.
Well, outside of labor issues, right, and that was just seen as communism at that point was a rabble-rousing ideology towards business interest. Is that fair to say? I mean, it doesn't seem like the same existential threat as in the post-war period that I think a lot of American conservatives still equate with, he's a communist, with Stalinism, and not necessarily.
Well, by the 30s, the U.S. Communist Party was a Stalinist party.
Right, yeah.
Okay, that was, Moscow called the shots in that regard.
But nobody thought of it in terms of this is our co-equal competitor on the world stage. Well, we weren't there yet.
Part of it had to do with the whole sort of perception. Remember, you're also talking about a period which is the FDR administration.
Yeah.
And the New Deal was all about various social reforms. And FDR and people in his administration, for the most part, were certainly not communists. But on the other hand, the Communist Party was broadly supportive of the New Deal. Mm-hmm. Now, in the long run, they wanted to put all of those people up against the wall and have them shot and do the rest. But in the meantime, the New Deal provided the kind of reformist atmosphere which party members could participate in, and in which they could seem to be useful to some degree, because the party did have influence in certain labor unions. For instance, the whole CIO, which was largely a communist-led labor organization. Not to say that everybody in it was a communist, but the party was. The party is the leading element.
I don't think it's
in organizing it.
It's too extreme to say. Fellow travelers, right?
A lot of those. So the party was interested in organizing labor, but the other thing was, but you also keep in mind that the party's view of the way to take power was not through an election.
Yeah.
So you're not trying to organize. You don't have any illusions that you're going to enroll the American proletariat into a vast party and to legislate communism. Yeah. That eventually you have to do this through influencing people. So, and that's why something like that professional organization number 122 of the California Communist Party, who were they organizing? Well, they were organizing sort of academic workers, but scientists, engineers, educators,
people who would be useful,
people who would be useful and influential in many ways.
It's not a Debsian kind of electoral.
No, it's not just bronze steel workers in Pennsylvania that you're trying to get involved. If they're But
Right.
you're trying to get the scientists, engineers, intellectuals within the party, people who would then move into positions of, running government agencies, whatever they might be. That's the whole way through infiltration and manipulation of the existing organizations. And the New Deal environment was fairly hospitable towards that. The communists under the FDR's administration were not seen as a major threat. In some ways, they were, on a certain level, they were allies towards advancing the progressive or reformist agendas of the Roosevelt regime. Now, they needed to be kept at arm's length in some way, but that was
What was his
okay?
His vice president, Henry
Wallace.
Henry Wallace. I kept wanting to say Henry Stemson. Like, no, that's Secretary of State. Yeah, Henry Wallace. Now, was Wallace like a Debsian socialist, or was he a communist? I forget.
He certainly came under the influence of communists around. I mean, so in 1948, when he runs on the was the Progressive Party for president, was that. It wasn't created by the Communist Party, but was it backed and supported by did the party put its weight behind it? Yes, because Wallace was seen as, again, I think Wallace is still more a member of the I'm not a communist but club.
Yeah, he's a pinko, right? Yeah.
Pinko.
Yeah.
There we go. But Wallace was also drawn towards occultism.
Why are they all? Everybody's so.
Okay, isn't everybody? Okay, that's the whole thing. Why are we so surprised that people get drawn towards this stuff?
I don't know. It's grown up in
no, he was,
on the Bible.
He sort of grew for a while in this Russian mystic theosophist Nikolai Roerich, who also was enlisted by Soviet intelligence for his own purposes.
Well, that takes me back to the question about the milieu of the time period. I mean, theosophy is what, 1880s heyday, 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, spiritualism. Like, my thought was always it kind of died. But in the 20s, you have a lot of...
Well, you got the original theosophy under Madame Blavatsky.
Right, yeah.
She dies in, 1890s, 1891. She'd also been exposed pretty effectively as a fraud, or at least partly a fraud, during her lifetime. But that didn't stop true believers. Okay, that will never stop them.
Yeah.
Okay. But then theosophy began to split into different branches, all led by women. Catherine Tingley was one, but maybe one of the most influential was Annie Besant.
Okay.
And Besant and Ledbetter, and they're the ones who, of course, try to create this Indian kid Krishnamurti into a kind of new messiah.
Yeah.
Which he eventually figures out at some point he's being used and breaks with them.
I never understood what happened with that. It always seemed like a weird scheme. Like, what? Well, I'm getting this way off. Sorry.
Yes,
we'll cover that later.
A topic for another time in this case. But Besant is also very pro-communist.
Okay.
I mean, she effectively... she also is a card-carrying member. I'm not or maybe I am secretly a communist. She's very, very sympathetic to that, and there were many people in theosophy who were.
Is that because it's a herald of the new? It's the
new era. It's the new aeon which is going to take place, and communism is all about being it's millennial in this case. I mean, literally, the goal was eventually to create a paradise on Earth. So anyone who sees the creation of a paradise on Earth literally or figuratively has something in common with that idea. There's a kind of mutual communication.
So what about, I just got to ask real fast, like Nazi occultism, what's the same appeal, essentially? Or like right-wing occultism?
Well... I'm not sure occultism has a right wing or a left wing.
Well, I just mean
it always tries to adapt itself. Yeah. It's just simply a methodology.
Okay,
and it's a way of I'd come back. One of the basic tenets of occultism is that reality is malleable.
Okay,
you can change it. Remember, through the application of will, you can make things turn out the way you want to.
Yeah.
So what's the whole Nazi rally? What's the film called? Triumph of the Will. Okay. And that's literally what the idea is. That, we will this. We collectively will this to happen. And this is a celebration of how we have completely transformed Germany in this idea. Okay. That's a very occult concept. Literally saying triumph of the will.
Yeah.
Crowley would say Magic is the art and science of causing change to occur in conformity with will. And what Hitler was saying in 1934, 1935 was that we have changed history in conformity. Communism sought to change history in conformity with will. So there's a
it's a
parallel in thinking
for whatever.
It's a state of mind that you would enter into. But there's also something else that Parsons became in this period between 35 and 39, in the years leading up to World War II, that another public incident he became involved in was that he was a key witness in a trial that took place in L.A. And the fellow on trial was a former L.A. police officer, detective by the name of Earl Kennett. He was part of the LAPD's intelligence squad. And Kennett was convicted very largely on Parsons' testimony, his expert testimony of having planted a bomb in the car of another ex-LA cop who had exposed, I can't think of the name of Harry Raymond. Let me double check that name here. Got it here somewhere. Looking around. Yeah, Harry Raymond.
Okay.
What do you know?
I'm always surprised at your ability to do just off a little sheet.
But so Harry Raymond went public with corruption. Imagine that, corruption
in the police force,
in the LAPD. Who would have thought in the 1930s LAPD there would be corruption? And Earl Kennett planted a bomb in his car, which went off and injured him, and therefore attempted murder. And the whole thing was, of course, to describe the construction of the bomb. And in this case, Parsons got a lot of newspaper coverage.
Yeah.
This is where you'll see the famous picture of him, which often shows up whenever somebody says Jack Parsons, and it's him holding a pipe bomb.
Right? I don't know.
And what he's holding up, this is him demonstrating by studying the remains of the bomb in the car, he reconstructed what he thought the bomb was, and that's him showing it off. It's not him lighting a bomb to throw at somebody. Right. And that got him a lot of publicity. It also earned him the undying hatred of Earl Kennett, who was sent to prison. And in the judgment of many, might have gotten off if it wasn't for Parsons. Now, the interesting thing again is that Parsons this is also where he got the public reputation of being a scientist and an expert in terms of explosives, even though academically he wasn't. Although he was quite correct, probably in his reconstruction of this. And the reason why that becomes significant is that only shortly before Parsons' fatal accident, as is often assumed, in June 1952, guess who got out of prison? Earl Kennett.
Interesting.
Therefore, some have argued that a guy who tried to kill someone with a bomb and who had a long grudge against Parsons gets out of prison, and then shortly thereafter, Parsons dies in an explosion.
That's way more interesting than he kind of went off the deep end and then somehow messed up.
Is that an explosion? Is that it? Probably not, but just keep that. I mean, see, there's another story you can come up with it. Yeah. That's the whole explanation of it. It's Earl Kennett getting back at him.
Yeah.
So it's around this time, probably in January 1939, about the time that he seems to be parting with his communist friends. The Kennett trial has earned him a certain amount of public acclaim, notification. The rocket experiments are, still part of the Suicide Squad, but that's advancing as well. War's right around the corner. That Jack and Helen Parsons attend a Gnostic mass at the Winona Boulevard headquarters of what was then the Agape Lodge of the Ordo Templi Orientis. That's the OTO.
It's Crowley's.
That's Aleister Crowley's secret society, his esoteric order, or at least the outward esoteric order, one of them. Mm-hmm. It's also, at that time, in 1939, the only operative lodge of the OTO.
Ever?
Anywhere. There have been other ones, but the organization is not going particularly well. And the only place, there may have been a kind of lodge in London which is still eking out in existence, but pretty much the Agape Lodge, the Love Lodge, in L.A., in Hollywood, that's it. All right, and there may be a dozen, and so the guy who's running it is a guy by the name of Wilfred Smith. He's English in origin, had come to L.A. some years in the 1920s, had been working trying to organize a group of the OTO during the 1930s. And the group had always had kind of trouble getting off the ground, and so he's an employee of the Southern California Gas Company. Okay, that's what his day job is. Yeah. So he's the head of the OTO. He's the high priest there, but in the daytime he's an accountant for the gas company. Other prominent members are Jane Wolfe. She was a kind of, an actress of, not a lead actress, because have you ever heard her name? Well, you'd have to look through the credits to find her. She was kind of a character actress in the 20s in silent films and going back before that. She has some Hollywood connections, although not many. Another important figure is Regina Call. She's a voice teacher for the most part. She does teach classes at LA City College. There are people who take her classes who get parts in movies. She knows people who work there. Other people who kind of come and go from these meetings and at the Winona Boulevard House are like John Carradine, the actor.
Is it James Carradine's?
He's the father to all subsequent Carradines.
Okay.
David, Robert, all the rest of them. They're all the kids of John Carradine. John Carradine is this kind of gaunt actor who was he's in
David Carradine.
He's David Carradine's dad.
Yeah. Okay.
But he appears in a lot of horror movies. So he's not quite as big a deal as Lugosi and Lon Chaney and Boris Karloff, but John Carradine is a part of that. Okay. He's also one of the drinking buddies of John Barrymore, part of the Bundy Boys, this sort of group of actors who tended to carry out various drunken, depraved pranks.
Okay.
As a part of that. And he's often presented as being an actual member of the OTO, which apparently he never was. He attended. They would have these kind of public gatherings. They would, they're trying to recruit people. Yeah. So they would invite you to come for the Gnostic Mass, which was was held in the attic of the house. Yeah. And the whole Gnostic Mass, if you're thinking of a Catholic Mass, it's not really like that. There's the high priest and the priestess, and there's a distribution of cakes of light, which are these little, brownies, sort of, think of the other ways, cookie. Prepare them in different forms, which traditionally includes semen and menstrual blood. Just keep that in mind if you're ever offered one. And it's the Gnostic Mass is relative, is fairly tame. Yeah, in that respect, there was often a kind of sex party that followed. I mean, a lot of the people who seemed to be attracted to this were swingers. Yeah. I think that it was I'm sure there are people who would be horrified by that, but my sense of it is that a lot of the people who came to these gatherings were there because it was considered to be sort of sexually freewheeling. It was also a very, a lot of people from the sort of Hollywood and LA gay crowd came there because they were tolerated. There were no inhibitions towards that. And, Carradine came there just to sort of soak up the atmosphere so he could go then learn how to play a crazed cultist in Voodoo Man, which was a movie he was part of. So if you ever see Voodoo Man and you see his crazed cultist impersonation, Carradine later credited attending the after parties of the Gnostic Mass as a way of getting a sense of that.
Now we're going to have to go watch Voodoo Man.
Yeah, it's just, so it was kind of an ongoing, moving sort of sex party that attracted a lot of people to it because they took very liberal attitudes towards that. Of all varieties, all sexual sects were welcome there. And So the Parsons get invited there by this couple, the Baxters. I can't remember their first name, but they were a brother and sister, and apparently they were both gay.
Okay.
Right? And they were like a brother and sister, gay lesbian team, and they were both apparently both sort of mutually interested in Helen and Jack for their own reasons.
Okay.
And we're trying to draw them into this sex party.
Yeah.
The relationship doesn't seem to have gone there, but that's how they and Jack took to this, and again he was already to some degree acquainted with Crowleyan philosophy, and so he and Helen become kind of enthusiastic participants in this. And in the years that follow, Wilfred Smith, the head of this kind of struggling cult, has a very difficult relationship with his overlord in London, Aleister Crowley. So this is in the latter years of Crowley's life. He's not doing well. He's bankrupt.
Yeah.
He's basically living off the charity of British intelligence at this point.
Yeah.
The other ones who are paying for everything. And Crowley constantly wants money. And the correspondence between he and his followers in Southern California are just his incessant demands that they collect every bit of money. They get people in there, get money from them, and send it to him.
Yeah.
And Smith seems to try to do this as much as possible, but eventually just, Crowley just unceremoniously in the middle of the 40s will just relieve him of command. We'll just say, you're out. You need to go on a magical retreat. So I want you to go live in the desert for a while. Go out here, go on a magical retreat. Get in touch with things. And this is where then Parsons, which is younger, better looking, seems to have much more energy than Smith was at this case. He is then sort of recruited to be the new head. But he will only head the OTO really briefly. I mean, really only 43 to 45, I'm thinking, in this case. That's about it, even to that long. He's only there for a couple of years before, again, he either gets bored with it, also because his connection with what appears to be a strange sex cult is causing problems with his security clearances.
Yeah.
This is the Crowley's name for his religion, the overarching philosophy behind this, is Thelema, will, or Thelema, if you prefer. Thelema, potato. But Thelema is part of this. The FBI in their investigations doesn't get the name quite right, and they think it's the Church of Thelma. And they're very interested in who this Thelma could possibly be. Who's Thelma?
God is Thelma.
But it was, the Church of Thelma is behind this whole thing, and we're trying to figure out who Thelma is. So, and this is, J. Edgar Hoover, by the way, is very aware of who Aleister Crowley is.
Why?
Well, this goes all the way back from Crowley's activities in the U.S. in 1918, 1919, when Hoover, although relatively, not in running the FBI at that point, he knows him by reputation. He doesn't like him, and Hoover has a great. There is this constant half-hearted effort by Wilfred Smith and the OTO Lodge, the Agape Lodge in L.A., to get Crowley out of England and bring him to L.A.
Yeah.
That was their kind of unfulfilled dream. They actually buy land to build a house for him.
Wow.
There's like land in San Diego County that actually was deeded over to Aleister Crowley.
Wow.
But they were never able to accomplish that. And part of it was that Hoover would wanted nothing to do with this at all. And was never going to allow Crowley back into the country. So that's one of the things that would get interest. And, that Parsons' connection to Crowley would draw attention from someone, including J. Edgar Hoover. And it would draw negative attention and an investigation. So I think that's part of why he began to draw back from it. Also, boredom might be a part of it. Interesting things would come out of this. Jack Parsons, true to his free love view, he had explained to this Helen early on that there was no way that he didn't believe in monogamy, and therefore she was quite used. She mentioned at some point she would come up to their bungalow in Pasadena, and some woman would go running out the back door, and she'd go, "Well, you have to tell. They just have to run. They can stay around for a cup of coffee or something." But she did get, I think, a bit more upset when Jack took a particular attention to her younger teenage sister, Sarah. Okay. Also known as Betty. I'll never forget that. Okay. Her name is Sarah. Everybody calls her Betty. She's Helen's younger sister. And Jack just seems to go, he wouldn't admit it, but he was probably in love with Betty.
So, not that it matters, but are they still outwardly presenting as church-going Christians, or is like they?
No. I think they've long since. Now, her family, the Northrop family, was they were.
That's what I figured.
Very straightforward Christians in this case. They weren't too pleased with their son-in-law. Yeah. But Jack takes up with Betty. He and Helen will eventually divorce.
Yeah.
I think that's 45 or 46. And then Helen, who sort of stays with the OTO, she then turns around and marries Wilfred Smith, who returns from his exile in the desert, and then he marries Jack Parsons' ex-wife, and they remain married until till Smith's death in the 1950s. I don't think. Well, they don't get married. They lived together for a long time. They don't apparently get married until the early 50s. Someone actually found their marriage certificate at some point, but they become a couple. So she takes up with the high priest of the OTO that her husband's had replaced, and then he takes up with her little sister, and then that goes all the well. But then Betty gets stolen from Jack by L. Ron Hubbard.
L.
Ron Hubbard shows up.
Yeah, all the ladies
and runs off. He apparently was quite the ladies' man. At that point.
That's what I've heard. I've heard that.
There's a description. Someone who was around at that point, mentions the fact that he and Betty Northrop apparently became quite the couple. And in the whole environment of free love, Jack was supposed to put up with that.
Yeah,
but
right.
Everyone noticed the fact that he really, in the name of what he believed in, he had to tolerate L. Ron Hubbard, as one person put it. Him smooching with Betty was like a starfish devouring a clam. I want you to keep that image in your head. But he took it probably quite hard. That seemed to have been a situation with him, and that's also why his relationship with Hubbard didn't. That and the fact that Hubbard stole money from him, but ran off with his girl and his money.
Sounds like what
we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves here. So while all of this is going on, in his personal life is changing around. The war is going on, and all of the former experimentation with rocketry and solid fuel has eventually paid off. And Jack Parson comes up with his great invention, which is the jet-assisted takeoff rocket, the JATO. Okay, those are the type of things that would be attached to heavily laden planes to help jet assisted, still used to help transport planes, particularly whose engines couldn't quite get them off, would help them. And this all was thanks to the development of solid fuel rocket engines, the miracle ingredient of which was asphalt.
Yeah, you mentioned that in another episode. Really? What gave you that?
One of the ideas he supposedly got this from was with the old recipe for Greek fire, the sort of Byzantine inventions of burning up opposing ships and how you could mix this together. Right. But asphalt, it's a combustible mixture. It's petrochemicals, but it will burn. I don't know if you ever tried to set a road on fire, but it doesn't burn quickly, although it will burn. And that was the mixture that would slow, you would have a very powerful combustion, but it would be controlled. And this won him more contracts with the Army. And so he and some of his partners, Frank Molina, Ed Foreman, and others, formed a company in 1942 called the Aerojet Corporation.
Okay.
One form or another, I think it's still around. It was later bought out by General Tire, which came asphalt. There you go.
I mean, I was thinking about, yeah.
So they formed the Aerojet Corporation, which, to license these to the military. A couple of years later, though, I think is in 1944, towards the end of the war, this is where General Tyre comes along, and they buy him out.
Yeah.
Actually, they offer to have him work for them, but Jack Parsons is not a corporate guy. He's not going to do that. So he gets bought out for cheap. I think it's like $10,000. It's not much. He could have asked for a lot more. But it seemed like a lot of money to him, so what does he do? He takes that money. Now remember, as a kid, he had grown up in a mansion on Millionaires Row on Orange Grove Avenue in Pasadena.
Yeah.
That was what he remembered. That was his childhood Eden. So now with this money in hand from cashing out of Aerojet, he takes it and he rents a house on Orange Grove Avenue on Millionaires Row, and he turns this into what he calls the Parsonage. So it's a big sprawling house, and he turns it into a commune basically. And he's there, he's there with Betty. Helen's still living there. There are OTO people. He opens it up to them. You have to be kind of bohemian, but there are also a lot of Caltech people who are there. Scientists, engineers. An example of that is a fellow by the name of Robert Cornog, who becomes a friend of his, and who actually lives at the parsonage for a while. And you got to keep in mind what's going on. I mean, there are scientists and engineers living there. Parsons, on the other hand, is having his own, having sort of regular magic rituals, summonings of Pan. And people just kind of accept this, or in some ways get drawn. The effort here is to try. Eventually, the OTO itself moves its headquarters to this place, along with him. And Cornog is interesting because Cornog is a Caltech. What is he working on during the war? He's working on the Manhattan Project.
Wow. Okay.
Right. So, and he's not the only one. So there are people who are working or connected to Los Alamos, and the single most secret military scientific project in the U.S., the atomic bomb project, are there. Hanging out at this place where, which is kind of this ongoing orgy in some ways. I mean, the whole thing is a complete free love atmosphere. There are occult rituals, orgies going on. There are all kinds of ways in which people could be very easily compromised.
Yeah.
Cornog will eventually, I think at 47, lose his security clearance. One, because he was also found to have been a member of the Communist Party. Surprise, surprise. And so not specifically because of his association with Parsons, but that didn't help.
Yeah.
That was one of the things that was seen as a negative in this case. But that, again, is an interesting... So Parsons is running this kind of bohemian, nonstop bacchanalia, which is going on. And he's bringing in people who are involved in a whole variety of high secrecy clearance military projects, where they're involved in any number of activities that could lead to them being blackmailed.
Is this related?
Imagine the I mean, if you were a Soviet intelligence officer, that would be the very type of thing you would want to infiltrate. I mean, it would be perfect for everything that you wanted to do.
Well, remember we were, maybe this is a conversation we had before we even decided to do a podcast, but I always asked, I asked something to the effect of like, well, why occultism? It's like, well, you can run stuff. You run other activities under the cover of, oh, look at this kooky cult, kooky sex cult or whatever, UFO cult. Oh, they're also running guns, or they're also doing something intelligence-wise. Why are they interested in, and there's other things, the weaponized magic stuff that we talked about. Mm-hmm. But would this be one of them? Like, is the OTO a cover for what he's really doing? Or is it just kind of like, well, so happened to be, 80% is a communist and, big on the
well, the OTO in and of itself, if you look, I mean, you read these things that, it was very influential in Hollywood and all that, but you don't see any of that. There's no sign of that anywhere. I mean, again, if you look at the hardcore, which were never many, it's a small group at the most there are, maybe a few bit players and character actors and dancers
Yeah.
who come through this. But I've never been able to find any confirmation that there are any people of any significant influence in Hollywood who were ever a part of it.
So it's more the science.
But what it did do, though, it did by bringing in Parsons, by recruiting him, it then brought in other people who are connected with the technical and scientific community. And so, again, you have to go on into the type of people who are attracted to this. One of the main attractions of the group for many of the people was the whole sort of free love environment. Remember, it's also an environment that was very, very tolerant of homosexuality, which society was not at that time.
Yeah.
So imagine the things that are compromisable.
Right, yeah.
Okay. Get people who have sources of potentially important technical information and lure them into a potentially compromising situation.
Right.
It isn't to say that it has to be that, but it would be perfect
right.
for that purpose.
Yeah.
So if, and again, it's an if, Parsons was collaborating with Soviet intelligence in that regard for whatever reason, ideological, ego, compromise, money, that this was the perfect situation to exist. You couldn't have asked for a better one in that respect. Now, it's around this time, as the war is coming to an end, it's in late 1945, that a fellow by the name of Lafayette Ronald Hubbard, L. Ron Hubbard, who had been in the Navy, who had been a not terribly successful officer in the Navy, but had at a certain point held an he'd been in naval intelligence. And his naval career is pretty checkered. I mean, if you look at it, he was, he kept losing or wrecking ships. But the interesting thing to me, though, is he would keep getting other commands.
Yeah.
Whereas you might assume that he just be completely shit-canned out of the whole thing. But instead, he sort of, which raises a certain amount of suspicion that maybe he wasn't quite as bad an officer as he appears. Maybe that's what it was supposed to look like. Or maybe he was, and they just had to find something for him to do. So, he spent a fair amount of time kind of malingering around, arguably. Okay, I'm just bringing it out to Scientology. I just think that's alleged. Okay, I'm not saying it's true. All these things are alleged. Could have had a great military career. Okay, maybe not. It's just alleged that he didn't.
Sure.
But what isn't alleged is that he basically shows up at the parsonage in late 45. He and Parsons form a kind of friendship. Hubbard becomes a full-blown participant in his magical rituals. In early 1946, he and Parsons go out to the Mojave Desert somewhere, and they famously engage in the Babylon working.
Right.
So one of the things that Parsons wanted to do in the spirit of Crowleyism was to incarnate the goddess Babylon. That's Babalon, not like the city.
Sure.
And she is, by the way, this is the whore of Babylon.
Yeah.
Which is the city. I don't know.
Yeah.
But this is the whore of Babylon, who has now been transformed within Crowleyism into a kind of earth sex goddess, female avatar of something. She's their version. She's the anti-Virgin Mary. Maybe that's the best way to describe it. There's the Antichrist, which, by the way, Parsons decided he was now. He's now the Antichrist.
He's taking it on.
So, I mean, that's the thing. So he's the Antichrist. So if you're the Antichrist, you got to have the anti-Virgin Mary to show up as well.
So
no, it doesn't matter whether or not she's your mom, because, remember his whole edible complex with his mom. This gets really weird. So he's going to summon the anti-virgin, and they're having these rituals in the desert. Where those were held is still a matter of controversy. I've had different people go, it was here, it was there. The only thing that I can recall that Parsons mentions is that the rituals were mostly carried out beneath the intersection of two power lines that crossed out in the desert.
Yeah.
And I've never gotten a good enough map of the California power line alignments to know where in 1946 those would be, but that would give you a pretty good idea. But, mostly there were these kind of rich, Hubbard is basically acting as the scribe Parsons basically is going out to the desert, making incantations and jerking off. Okay, that seems to be that's what it comes down to, ladies and gentlemen. And he's going to summon Babylon. He's going to show up. Yeah. She's going to be this fire elemental, and it seems to be kind of free form in terms of what. Now, keep in mind, this is at a point when he's like lost his girlfriend to Hubbard, which he's supposed to be okay with and isn't, and now he's like praying that this magical girlfriend is going to show up. What eventually happens is that Hubbard and Parsons enter into this idea that they're going to buy yachts, I think in Florida, sailing boats, and they're going to sail them around and sell them, make a lot of money. Parsons gives Hubbard some money to go and buy the boats. He takes Hubbard's allegedly cheats Parsons out of the money. Parsons is very displeased with this, and that's the kind of end of their relationship. Now, how did L. Ron Hubbard later spin this activity? I mean, he couldn't deny that he didn't hang out at the parsonage, couldn't deny that he didn't engage in various occult rituals with Jack Parsons, so why was he doing this? Well, his argument was that he was working for naval intelligence.
Okay.
That they had caught on that Parsons and his little commune were all part of an effort to entrap and compromise American engineers and scientists.
Okay.
And he was sent in to break up this insidious black magic cult that Parsons was running. Now, in the process of this, he never says anything about Russian spies being involved in it, but it's kind of implicit that that's what they were afraid of, that American scientists were being lured into this libertine environment and compromised, and Hubbard later credits himself with doing it because eventually Parsons ran out of money.
Well, doesn't Hubbard also come or try to spin himself as like this big American patriot or something? Wasn't there?
Yeah, well, this is his way of presenting. You see, I was really working for American intelligence.
Sounds like Crowley
thwarting this horror, and I don't totally think that's BS. I mean, it could be that it's Hubbard. Depends on what you want to think of L. Ron Hubbard. I know that many people listening to this think the worst things possible of L. Ron Hubbard. I will be an agnostic on that point. Okay, I make no representations one way or the other, but he may have been telling the truth, because that would make sense in a certain amount. I mean, there were questions about what Parsons was doing. There were a lot of concerns about the security implications, particularly, and the importance of the people who were involved, Coronog being an example, Parsons himself, in terms of what they were up to, and that naval intelligence might have sent in someone to get an idea of what was taking place wouldn't be a bad idea. But then he and Hubbard break up. And then who almost immediately shows up? Why, Babylon, in the personage of Marjorie Cameron. Okay, so Marjorie Cameron, she was a stunning redhead. I'll say this for Marjorie Cameron, or she liked to be called Candy.
Okay.
Or later on, just Cameron. She goes through a lot of changes. But Marjorie Cameron who had she been working for during the war? Why, the U.S. Navy.
Oh, really?
In Washington, D.C., technically in a kind of cartographic element, but she also made references of being used as a kind of in a honey trap.
Yeah.
Okay. She's very good looking, and supposedly she had been sent out by her superiors to essentially seduce some guy who they thought might be an enemy agent in one form. So here you get this suggestion, if you piece it together, that just like Hubbard, Marjorie Cameron had been in the Navy, and she apparently, by her claim at least, had been involved in some kind of undercover intelligence work.
Okay.
Now, a man who would later claim to be spying on Parsons for the Navy, Hubbard, has now just left. He's burned his bridges. And who literally shows up knocking on the door and then enters into a passionate sexual relationship with Jack Parsons, Marjorie Cameron.
Yeah.
So was she just Hubbard's replacement?
Where would you find I mean, would you look in declassified documents when they do these large sweeps of declassified material and don't tell people what's in it? How would you confirm that?
How would you ever confirm that? Well, you'd have to find orders from some sort of superior assigning her to that, if anything was ever put into writing.
Right. Yeah.
But if you do it right, you never do it that way.
Yeah.
Okay. And there again is a certain basic rule. Don't never put into writing what can be conveyed verbally.
Yeah.
Now, that again doesn't insist that that's the way that it has to be, and that's not what I'm doing. I mean, I think could be, maybe the Babylon workings, and that's what drew her there. Yeah. She didn't even know it. Yeah. Okay. Jack Parsons thought that's who she was.
Why?
Well, because she was a redhead. Okay. He was looking for a fire elemental, and he was really smitten by her. So he was trying to summon an astral girlfriend, and then this woman then shows up. And it apparently worked. As far as he was concerned, she was the result of the Babylon workings. And maybe she was. There's one narrative. Okay. The other, she was sent there by the Navy to continue the same sort of work that Hubbard was.
Yeah.
Or you can even spin this a different way if you want to, that Hubbard is the Russian spy.
Okay.
Allegedly. Okay. This is just possibility.
Is it on the same followers?
And that she was then sent to recover from that situation.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, Marjorie Cameron is an interesting and difficult woman. She's, there are mental issues with her. I don't think anybody would deny she has a lot of strange things going on in her head.
Elaborate.
Well, she would later make statements where she would kind of seemingly half admit that she thought that Hubbard actually had been working for the Navy. She wouldn't deny that possibility. So that at least had occurred to her. And maybe that had occurred to her, or she couldn't come right out and say it because she was doing for the same thing. She never, so far as I know, in any way intimated that her appearance in Parsons' life had any connection to the Navy.
Yeah.
But then she probably wouldn't. That would spin it. They eventually would marry quite early on. They had a fairly tempestuous relationship. She would kind of come and go. Neither one of them were much in terms of fidelity, but Parsons really seems to have been even more smitten with her than he was with Betty Northrup. But she would sort of take off and disappear in Mexico, and then she would come back for a while. But otherwise, you can see these pictures of them. They just look like this sort of post-war California couple, and they go to barbecues at people's houses.
Was she doing OTO stuff too?
Well, initially, she has no interest in this. Yeah. I mean, according to her, she'd never heard of, she had no acquaintance with occultism. But, drawn into a relationship with Parsons, he inevitably brings her into it, and then she would develop a kind of lifelong attraction to it later on. You can, as far as you can tell, they had a very strong emotional and sexual bond, but it was their personalities also made that difficult in some way. And so it was a passionate but tempestuous relationship. And of course, it doesn't last all of that long, because in June of 1952, after their most recent reconciliation, what Parsons is doing, he has his own sort of little private lab in a shed. He keeps his chemicals there, many of which are volatile, one of which is fulminate of mercury, which is really volatile. And that's supposedly what kills him, is that he drops a can of fulminate of mercury. And there is a fatal explosion. And really, you need no more than to explain that. So this is a fellow who had spent much of his life, he's 37 at the time, dealing with dangerous chemicals, and eventually he makes one mistake, and you don't get to make two mistakes with those type of thing. So I don't say any of that. Now, could Earl Kennett have, come out of prison and started? That is a possibility. The other possibility, where things get complicated, is that in the meantime, remember, Parsons had sold out cheap from Aerojet. he and some of his friends had then tried to reform another company, but he'd gone to work, I think, for North American Aviation for a while, then later for Hughes Aircraft, all working on military rocket projects, highly classified projects. He also visited places like Redstone Arsenal in Alabama, where he met Werner von Braun.
Well,
okay, so these he goes to Washington. He meets with people from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Parsons has access. He has access to secret weapons programs. He has access to the engineers and scientists working on those programs. He has access to important people in D.C. So again, as a potential intelligence source, he would be priceless.
Yeah.
On the other hand, as a fellow who was, it brings this possibility that he's also working as really a double agent for American intelligence, because his contacts with military and intelligence people in Washington could mean that he had been recruited by them. Mm-hmm. And that maybe that's part of the angle to it as well. But one of the things that happens is, I think, beginning in 47, he loses his security clearance. And actually, there had been the first dust-up occurred in 1945. So I think it was he and Frank Molina, one of his friends. I think it was Frank Molina. Maybe it was Ed Foreman. They were trying to, through their military connections, they were trying to get access to a newly developed explosive. And this explosive was something connected to a secret project called X-metal. Now, what that was, X-metal is uranium. And this is all a subset of the Manhattan Project. And in fact, the explosive that they were trying to get samples of for their work was one of the explosives being developed for the explosive lens around the plutonium core and the atom bomb.
Okay.
So once that was discovered, whether there was an investigation. Why are you trying to, this is where they're deliberately trying to poke now, that could just, their claim, they didn't know it was an accident.
Yeah.
Or was it not an accident?
Yeah.
Now, if you were a security officer, what would you think?
Oh, yeah, I know. So when did the Soviets get the bomb?
49.
49, oh.
Well, they don't develop the bomb, but they're getting,
this is 45.
The Manhattan Project was full of holes.
Oh, yeah.
But through different means, and not just through one source, they're collecting all these bits and pieces of information.
This is 45.
So eventually the investigation decides it was just a mistake. But then in 47, there's another issue that comes up, and there's another investigation, and he loses his security clearance. He makes an appeal to that, and it's restored in 49. So he gets it back. He goes to the Industrial Relations Board, makes an appeal, gets it back. And then in 51, when he's working for Hughes on another government project, he loses it for a second time. So this is a third strike at this point. Now, how did he lose this? Well, he took home notes on a classified project. He took them out of the office at Hughes, took them home, and hired a stenographer to type them up for him.
Oh, come on, dude.
Because he was going to give them to someone else.
Wow. Well, okay.
Okay.
That's
okay.
All right.
At that point, he loses security clearance again, quite rightly, I would argue.
Yeah.
And he's never going to get it back. It's made clear that you're never going to work on any kind of classified project again.
Yeah.
That's it. Now, who is he typing these up for? He goes, well, I'm trying to get a job in Israel.
No, come on.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. And because he was approached by a guy in L.A. by the name, I think, of Herbert Rosenfeld. And Herbert Rosenfeld was the representative of American Technion Corporation.
Okay.
Technion Corporation, the original one, was an Israeli sort of R&D group of the Israeli military.
Okay.
Also connected to Mossad.
Yeah, well.
And the whole idea there was to develop rockets or explosives for the Israeli military. And, they wanted to get examples of what he was working on as to whether they were going to hire him. So he takes the notes, the classified notes from the project he's working on at Hughes, has them typed up, and he's going to hand them to Rosenfeld to hand them to the Israelis, or what he is told is the Israelis. Okay. So what's really going on here? There are all kinds of possibilities. But he loses that security clearance. He's never going to get it back. And so at the time he dies, he's packing everything up. He and Cameron are going to move to Mexico. And one argument, he's going to go to Mexico and he's going to start a fireworks company. Yeah, that's it. I'm going to make fireworks in Mexico because Mexico needs another gringo running a fireworks company.
Yeah, I mean,
there's not enough fireworks in Mexico.
Import them in. I mean, it's plausible, but
not really. Where do all the fireworks come from? Mexico.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Well, he makes them.
It could be
boom bigger, right?
Yeah, but then that was going to just be a way station until they were going to go to Israel.
Yeah, or
they were going to go somewhere. Now, here again, there were different possibilities.
So
this whole business about going to Israel is really, one could argue, is just the idea that you sort of run out your string in the U.S. You burned your bridges there. So it's time to defect, Jack.
Yeah, well,
it's time to come home, and we'll do it this way. Yeah. So here are different possibilities about his demise. One. U.S. intelligence found out about this and whacked him to make sure that he didn't take his talent and his knowledge to Moscow.
Right.
Or maybe the Soviets found out what he had been doing. Maybe that he had been working for the Americans, or that he was going to go, and they whacked him.
Yeah.
Or Earl Kennett whacked him. Or he just dropped a can of fulminated mercury. The basic fact is that he's blown up in his lab on the eve of his departure for some unknown life in the East.
Well, let's put a pin in that and just bring up the this won't evergreen, but the recent car Tesla blowing up outside of the Trump hotel. Have you seen the conspiracies around that? Was this guy shot himself in the head before the car drove itself to the why would he do that? Oh, is it because the email that he's trying to send out stuff.
Got a manifesto. He was at Fort Bragg.
Well, it was all about, I'm trying to report on this.
There were war crimes
and so, but was it intelligence killed this guy because he was on the eve of leaving to Mexico and blah, 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 blah. So, questions upon questions upon questions and possibilities, not outside the realm of this has been done before, right? This is a historical example of. At least that's how I make sense of this.
A guy parks his Tesla.
Yeah.
From the temple. These are the facts that we know. It blows up.
Yeah.
Not totally. It still seemed to be pretty much, as the explosions go, it wasn't all that big.
Yeah.
But then he's killed himself anyway, or something. And then that's the basic fact that you have. Okay, the guy was in the car. It blew up in that particular place at that particular time. All the rest are just the things that may be pointing in one direction or another. Who knows really what's going on?
And that's the same deal here.
That's the same deal here.
That's why I try to make the connection between contemporary examples of this kind of stuff, because it is, I won't say it's unsatisfying, but it leads you in a place I think most historical cases don't, which is there's a whole lot more you're dealing with kind of the, not inconsistency, what am I thinking of? There's just a lot more questions that arise and more possibilities when you're starting to deal with intelligence and espionage and
it opens up a whole other. Well, the thing with Parsons is that you can look at him in these different levels, and it's like you can look at pictures of his. If you look at sort of, the pictures that people took, he and Cameron would otherwise just appear to be a kind of regular couple. He and Helen would just, at some point, were just a kind of, they were just these people who lived down the street. He was some kind of engineer who worked in rocketeer, or he had these various things. I mean, you wouldn't look at that and see anything else into it. There were people who simply knew. The guy Rapinski, who was the used car dealer who knew Parsons. They were simply friends on that level. The people in the OTO knew him as someone else.
Yeah.
The people that he worked with in the military must have known him as someone else. The Caltech people did as well. So there are different Jack Parsons in different situations, moving among different groups of people, and yet that's all the same person.
Mm-hmm.
There aren't different Jack Parsons. There's only one, and that person then appears in different forms in different circumstances. And the question then often becomes, which is the real Parsons? Which of those is the most significant? Or is there any one which is significant in that case? So here again, this is where I would sort of come in and bring in the uncertainty principle, is that for the most part, in all these questions we raised, there are no definitive answers.
Yeah.
None. So what I've done here in this episode is to sketch out what I think would be the basic evidence or narrative to suggest that Parsons had some involvement in espionage. At the very least, that he would have been a target to be recruited.
Yeah.
Which then leaves the possibility that he was recruited. And he's not going to say so. It's like the idea that someone said that, it's like von Karman saying that he had a youthful flirtation with communism, but then he dropped it. Well, if you're being questioned by the FBI and you want to keep your job at Caltech, what else are you going to say?
Right. Yeah.
You're going to lie, regardless of what it is. Was Parsons' involvement of just trying to get samples of an explosive that just happened to being used in the Manhattan Project, was that just a mistake? Yeah. That's what he said. I didn't know. Or is he lying?
Yeah.
Because what else is he going to say? He can't very well admit things otherwise. So if anybody's actually doing the things that I'm suspecting the being of, they will of necessity lie about it in those situations. So their denials mean nothing.
Yeah.
And that's, again, the way, if you're a counterintelligence officer, you look at the fact that this guy is sitting here and go, no, I didn't do it. Yeah. Well, that's it. Okay. I don't get, that's what they all say.
Well, you've convinced me that there's a whole lot of potential ulterior motives, I guess, let's say, than the typical story of, this kooky guy.
Well, if the Soviets didn't try to recruit him, they weren't doing their job. And generally speaking, they did their job.
Yeah.
So they may have tried, as with Oppenheimer, there may have been an attempt to do it, and they failed. He might have been also recruited by the Americans as a double. I mean, any of those things are possibilities. And this is, what I'd want listeners to sort of keep in mind. You don't have to force this into a particular conclusion unless you're writing a screenplay.
Yeah.
Okay? You want to make a movie out of this, you're going to have to decide what goal you want to run towards with the ball. Otherwise, the reality is that it's all of these possibilities at once, with no absolute certainty of what's true and what isn't. And as usual, I say, that's what really makes things interesting. Because the mystery never goes out of it. Once you solve something, then the mystery is gone. And as long as it's an open question, well, there's always a possibility that you might solve it. Maybe something would come up one way or the other. Or maybe it will just remain a range of more or less probable things that might have happened. So you see that the most interesting thing to me about Jack Parsons isn't that he was a follower of Aleister Crowley. That's almost incidental in this.
Well, that's the thing that gets pulled out. I mean, I feel like all I ever know about him is it's the kind of the high clip version of, here's this rocket genius who was an occultist, and he did these weird, jerking off in the desert ceremonies. And isn't that kooky?
Yeah, he's just a weird guy. But he also was a brilliant, self-taught scientist, for lack of a better term.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and like you said, the intelligence angle, I think, is way more significant and way more interesting than he thought his occultism was somehow helping him with. Did he? I've heard that before.
Well, he always sticks with it. I mean, he abandons the OTO fairly quickly. He drops out of heading he gets sort of, I think he just got tired of dealing with these flaky people. I mean, it wasn't doing much of anything. It was causing problems with his work. But it doesn't mean that he ever abandoned his interest in Thelema or with Crowley. Crowley's attitude towards, initially Crowley is, really kind of, he was enthusiastic for anybody who, looked like they were going to, you don't have a lot of followers. And this guy, he was relatively young, looked like he might be kind of up and coming. But on the other hand, if you look at Crowley's reaction when Parson basically their communication is purely by letter. They never meet. That he and Hubbard are out in the desert trying to incarnate Babylon. Well, Crowley thinks that's the stupidest thing he's ever heard of. And, it's like, what do he complains, these guys have no idea what it is they're doing, and just bad things will come from this, and they're just being complete idiots. So there are a couple of ways you can interpret that. One is that Crowley knows that this is all bullshit, that these guys are taking this way too seriously, and, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Or that he knows that it's not bullshit, and that they're playing around with something that you shouldn't be.
Yeah.
And that's always the argument. I mean, there are people, for instance, one of the things you'll hear is that, okay, so, it was in 1947 and he and Hubbard were out there, and this is when Roswell happens. This is because what they did is they opened a portal to whatever that is, to another dimension, a hole, and flying saucers showed up.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, it wasn't in 47. It was in early 46. And so there's, oh, no, it's only a few months. Well, yeah, you can make that story up. But frankly, that's pretty lame. Okay, that's not much of a story there. It's a stretch, for the most part. But that's what people will do with it. But Crowley thought that they were being idiots, that they were messing around with something that they shouldn't be doing. And there was always the possibility that, leaving the whole UFO connection aside, which I frankly don't get, that maybe there was something that, that's the, the argument is that, that's what blew him up, is that he did conjure something out in the desert.
Okay. So I was scrolling through my phone trying to find this. This is from the American Historical Association. Okay. So this whole myriad of questions brings up the 5 C's of historical thinking. And I don't know, nobody's ever told me this. I just was looking up historical thinking for whatever reason a while back. So first C, change over time. Doesn't necessarily apply here. Mm-hmm. Context, the milieu, causality, right? Contingency and complexity. So these are, to think like a historian, you've got to kind of weave all these different things together. And I think we can say complexity here is, he's situated right at the crossroads of all these very important aspects of, pre and post-war society, or, the military. Intelligence obviously comes into play there. And the occult stuff, I think, I don't know. To me, at this point, after hearing your argument, it seems like it obscures, which maybe that's always the point of occult practices.
Well, occult is hidden.
Right? I know, right?
Hiding stuff. So yes, I think it can be often used in... Well, let's just take the argument, for instance, that everything connected to occultism and the rest of this is BS. It's in some way sort of sleight of hand, self-hypnotism, whatever the rest, that there's no reality to beyond that. But it's extremely effective in bamboozling people.
Yeah.
And of misleading them, of having people watch a magic show. Except in this case, they think the magic show is real.
Stage magic versus...
All right. Yeah. That it's all stage magic in one form or another. But except the point you convince them that the stage magic isn't stage magic because there's something else called real magic, but it's all just basically the same BS. But you can get them to do... And I'm not arguing that's what it... I'm just saying that you can read it that way if you want to. If it was that... Or think of it this way. Regardless of the reality of the occult realm or not, whether magic is real or not, it can certainly be used to obscure, gull, and bamboozle people. in a way that not much else can. It's extremely influential in that way. It's a kind of mind virus that will infiltrate itself into an individual or into people,
right?
Make them behave in different patterns. It's a very effective way of manipulating people. And it doesn't have to be real to do that. It only has to be the semblance of being real. And to break it down this way, let's take occultism down to its most popular variety, religion.
Yeah.
Okay. I will argue that all forms of religion are some form of occultism.
Yeah.
And think of how influential that has been. Okay. You can argue that the beliefs and doctrines of the Catholic Church are totally BS. It's based upon nothing. There's no actual reality to it. Well, it doesn't matter. Okay.
Yeah.
Look at all this.
50 million Elvis fans can't be wrong.
Doesn't matter. It's still there, which then means that it achieves a kind of reality. And it's if a belief can shape people's view of reality, it becomes reality.
I don't know. I'm unsatisfied, but that's in a good way. I want to ask more questions. I want to go find evidence or documents or something. I mean, you are much more successful about this than I have ever.
Well, you find documents. All right, so you get a document. Well, does that prove anything?
Well, I mean,
maybe.
Depends.
But then the first thing you have to do is figure out whether that document is real.
Yeah.
Because a document's just things on a piece of paper. Documents are forged. Here's an example which takes us, back. Things since the 1980s, 1990s that have circulated around. There's a whole set of documents called the MJ-12 documents. And this all supposedly is the basis for believing that in the early 1950s,
right,
the U.S. government was all aware about the reality of extraterrestrials and UFOs and formed a special group called Majestic 12 or Magic 12 to study and investigate this. Well, you can take those documents as they've been released, and people very easily go through and demonstrate that there are all kinds of things wrong with them and that they're forgeries. Mm-hmm. If not all of them are, some of them are. Okay. Yeah. But what you got to, somebody gives you a group of documents and you look through it and you can find that maybe you got 100 documents there, but you can definitively prove that 5 of those documents are obvious forgeries. Well, then what
about the rest? Yeah.
Okay, that then contaminates everything else. Yeah. It contaminates everything which is there, and none of it can be taken at face value. So there's an earlier historical example of that. It's a thing called the Sison documents. The Sison documents were an American agent in Russia, Edgar Sison, newspaper man, in 1918 got a hold of, he was given this group of documents that showed the connections between the Germans and the Bolsheviks. Okay, all the names of people and the transfers between different banks and the and then the Nyabanken in Stockholm, etc., that were used, but those were, and the first they were taken as absolute proof of the German Bolshevik conspiracy that Lenin and his crew were just agents of the Germans taking money from them, and then of course as people began to study them, they found all kinds of inconsistencies. All right, that this agency didn't exist or this letterhead wasn't in use at the time, and the more you looked, the more flaws were found. Yeah. So they were then denounced as forgeries, which of course the Soviets immediately said, well, these are forgeries. See?
Yeah.
Well, the interesting thing about that later on is you find out that almost everything being described in these forgeries is true. Okay? The banks and the connections, the basic story being told in the Sison documents is true. Yeah. The Germans were supplying money to the Bolsheviks. I mean, mostly after they come to power, and Olaf Aschberg's Nyabanken in Stockholm was the ground. Yeah, it's there. Everything in there is kind of generally true.
Yeah.
So now you've got this weird situation in which a group of documents first presented to prove something are then shown to be contaminated with forgeries, thus apparently disproving what they sought to prove. But then later on, other sources show that what these documents are arguing is essentially true.
Yeah.
So the forgeries, even though they're forgeries. So you find the document, it could be a forgery. If it's a forgery, it could still be true. See, just because a document is forged doesn't mean what it's saying is true. So you find documentary evidence, and my challenge is, what have you actually found?
Yeah.
You found something that appears to be authentic, and 1, it may be authentic. 2, it may be a forgery so good that you can't disprove that it's not authentic, or it may be questionable, and therefore the information in it isn't true, or it may be an outright forgery, and the information it is wholly or largely true. Any of those are possibilities.
So when it comes to Parsons, like you said, there is no definitive answer. So what would be ways, aside from deducing what, like you have saying, he's coming in contact with these folks who are connected to the Communist Party. Here's naval intelligence getting involved with OTO and his activities. All you have are contacts, right? And this is the best inference you can draw is from the people around him. Is that...
Well, always use the 3-point rule. Anything else. Something happens once, it's an accident.
Yeah.
May not be, but that's what you can say it is. If it happens twice, it's a coincidence. Coincidences are ambiguous. Might mean something, might not. If it happens 3 times, it's enemy action.
Okay.
Now, that rule, things can happen 3 times and they may not be, but that's what you'd better go by. If you want to play it safe, if you want to stay alive, then that's what you should assume.
Yeah.
Okay. If it happens 3 times, it's not an accident. It's not a coincidence. Something is going on, and you'd better pay attention and take precautions. That's the only sensible thing to do under that situation. You don't have to have it absolutely proven beyond that point. You must assume that that's the case.
Okay.
And in terms of looking at something like this, you'd have to assume that that's probably... So if you look at Parsons, one, he has a Luciferian personality. He's sort of drawn to contrarian things in everything that he does. He does have contact with the Communist Party, people involved in the party, people in the party who were connected to Soviet intelligence. He is involved in highly classified, extremely important scientific research during the war that the Soviets would have been incredibly interested in getting details on. And he has the means and opportunity, and to a certain degree, the motive for doing that. So I think you've got your 3 points there.
Okay.
Which means it doesn't absolutely prove anything, but you cannot dismiss the possibility. You must assume that possibility was real. And if I was in counterintelligence and I encountered Jack Parsons, I wouldn't let him anywhere near anything that had security, because all of those points would suggest that he is a tremendous, which is eventually what happens to him.
Yeah.
He's too much of a risk.
Well, when you said the 3-point rule, the first thing I thought of was losing your security clearance 3 times.
Yes. Okay.
Maybe that's an indicator that you're not just up to no good, or oops, it was an accident. Maybe you're prodding.
Well, the first time he said it was an accident. Okay.
Yeah.
Second time was maybe, third time. No, that's just, and that was so, I don't even understand how in the last case he ever thought he would get away with that. Except that by that time, maybe he'd been doing that for some time. And was just being watched. But to actually remove the documents, now he returned them after he had them typed up. But okay, what you've basically said is that you're taking classified material, and you're transferring that material to someone else,
even if it is Israel, which we've always had a positive relationship with, but it's still classified documents.
Yeah. Until you find out that the Mossad itself is penetrated by the Soviets. Who knows?
Is it really?
Yeah, there was one. It wasn't Isser Harel, but yes, there were.
Interesting. That's another story.
Yeah.
Well, how do we land this plane? That's a good introduction to Parsons. I'm sure he pops up in other.
Well, if nothing else, I think it presents a view of him that generally doesn't come out. I mean, he's either the eccentric rocket scientist or the crazy Crowleyite, and he's all of those things, and he's just the guy who lives down the street and has a cute wife.
Yeah.
So it's a he's a complex character, and I think this just kind of adds to the complexity of it. So I know what I constantly seem to be saying is you can't believe anything you run across, and you can't. Okay, don't believe it. That's the whole point. Take it into account, consider it. You know, maybe that will become your favorite thing, but don't marry it.
Yeah,
because once you've done that, then you're never really looking at anything else, and you always should be.
So I think that's a good place to leave it.
I think so.